to everyone who's listening at the other end of the computer. I hope that you find the next hour of your life dedicated to this webinar a useful way to use your time. And I think that people that work with pigs or own pigs are a pretty special group. So yeah, I hope we can all find something out from tonight. So as Kimberly said, this presentation is divided up into 4 main sections. So the first section, which is kind of a long one, focuses on the responsibilities of owning pigs, and as Kimberly alluded to, most of the legislation is relevant to Victoria only. So I won't really be covering legislation in other states. I'll talk a little bit about marketing pig meat, because that's the ultimate thing that we want to have in the forefront of our minds before we even get pigs, is to have a think about, well, what am I going to do with my pigs? Piggery planning. So pigs can be perceived as being fairly, well, obnoxious critters by some neighbours, and there are some particular council requirements about having pigs in your backyard. And then the legal obligations in a little bit more detail. So the next section will focus on biosecurity, and so I'll be talking about how to prevent diseases, local diseases coming from your neighbours, or buying in diseases probably more importantly, and keeping your pigs from getting diseases down the track, and then a little bit about some important diseases you don't want to bring into Australia, so a little bit on spool feeding in there as well. And then sort of more on the nitty gritty about how to look after your pigs, some of the basics about what pigs require, and so housing pigs, feed and water requirements. And given I'm a veterinarian, I'll try and dedicate some time to some important economic diseases that will you really want to avoid. So the last section will talk about my comfort zone, which is pig health. So we'll get started into some of those sections. So the first section, responsibilities of owning pigs. So, and as I said earlier, you really need to think about, what am I going to do with my pigs, even before you get pigs. So you'll know that one sow will have, anything from maybe 15 piglets down to, sort of 8 piglets per litre, and they'll breed probably twice a year. So if you're going to be growing your pigs out, and most people tend to have their pigs grown out a live weight of sort of 80, 90 kilos, if you're sort of doing it more for a hobby than anything. So you're talking about maybe 60 kilo carcass weight. So if you're talking about maybe 20 pigs per sow per year times 60 kilos, that's an awful lot of pig meat that you're going to have to try and eat yourself, unless you have a plan B on what to do with all the other kilos. So, I mean, your friends and neighbours might help, but there are some pretty important rules you need to know around farm kills, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some people, you might be able to sell your pigs. You might sell them as weaner pigs, and most people, particularly people that rear pigs outdoors, will grow their pigs out at about 6 weeks of age and then wean them. So you might look to sell your weaners to somebody to grow out. So, there's private buyers. Some people might find that there's a niche breed of pigs that they enjoy, and there might be other people that are interested in buying those breeds of pigs. And of course there are butchers and wholesalers, but just remember that a lot of butchers will particularly they may want certain cuts of pork, and I mean, if we're getting down that list a little bit further, you're talking about restaurants. A restaurant might pay you, I don't know, $20, $25 a kilo for pork belly, but they may not necessarily want the rest of the carcass. So you really need to think about, well, what am I going to do with the pig meat that I'm producing, and if I can find a home for part of the pig, what will I do with the rest of the pigs? Abattoirs, and I mean, there's, I guess one of the tricky things about pigs is that the abattoirs that service the pig industry are kind of a contracting population as well. So there, I mean, if you're talking about Victoria, there are probably 2 major abattoirs now down here in Melbourne. We have had recent closures of domestic abattoirs in the last sort of 5 years. And so it's important that you have an abattoir in mind that would be able to process the pigs that you produce. I've touched on restaurants a little bit. Markets, again, if you're thinking about farmers markets, you need to contact your council. You'll find that some markets or some councils will only allow one particular, say if you're a pork producer, there might only be allowed to be one pork producer at the market. So if that person is already at the market, it will be flooded, so you can't necessarily set up there. And there's also requirements, legal requirements around producing and selling meat at farmers markets. And the last one is sale yards. Again, they are a contracting group. There used to be lots of sale yards around that might sell the odd pig, and certainly there were pig dedicated sale yards. So there's probably 3 or 4 large sale yards that still sell pigs around the country, but I don't know if I would be relying on sale yards as my outlet to sell my pigs. So you really need to think long and hard about what you're going to do with your pigs before you even get them. So one of the points I touched on was if you're going to grow your own pigs and you're going to decide to kill your pigs, and you might have friends and family that will help out in terms of eating the meat, there are some important rules that you need to, or laws that you need to be aware of. So certainly if you are going to kill a pig as a home kill, you need to make sure that you've been appropriately trained to kill a pig. And so that training should be documented. The important thing about home kills is that meat can't leave the property. So, if you are going to do a home kill, then, it's got to stay on your farm. You can process that meat into small goods, but the same rule applies, that the small goods cannot leave the property. The other important thing is that you also have to be designated as a farm to do a home kill. And as Kimberly touched on earlier, this legislation is Victorian legislation. So if you're from other states, you're going to have to look up your own legislation. And to be a farm, in Victoria, you need to be at least 32 kilometres from the GPO in Melbourne. You need to have at least 2 hectares of land, and that land has to be zoned for agricultural pastoral purposes. If you're not a farm and you want to have pigs and you want to have your pigs slaughtered, you must have your pigs killed at a licensed premises, in other words, an abattoir, or at a rendering facility. So you cannot have your pigs killed any other way. If you're talking about using farmers markets as an outlet for your pork, you need to have those pigs slaughtered, again, at a licensed facility. That facility's identification has to be put on the product that you're selling at the farmers market. You can transport the products to the market for sale, but again, the councils are going to have oversight of that. And again, as part of the laws requirement under the food authorities, if you want to sell the leftovers later, again, you must have a license to store and sell that meat. So if you're going to get into this sort of area, just be very aware of the legislation required within your council and within the state. The second part of this whole legislation area is really looking at what is required in terms of having a pig on your property. And up here I've put the basic requirements for having a pig. So, and again, this is Victorian focused. So I guess I apologise to people that aren't in Victoria. But if you have a pig, you have to have a permit. So there are two permit requirements. There's a simplified application, which is the smaller farm, and so in the left-hand side of that screen, there's a mention about STU. So that's basically an easy definition is well, one grower pig would be one STU. So you can see there for yourself that if you are a farmer who has less than 150 sows, you have your pigs kept outdoors in paddocks, you have less or equal to 12 STUs per hectare, you need to be able to shift the infrastructure where you house your pigs. So you might be aware that even if you had a 100-hectare paddock, if you had the pigs in that paddock, the pigs will tend to stay around the area where the shelter, the feed and the water is. So they're not going to move all around that paddock. They're going to stay sort of in a triangle between the shelter, food and water, and that's where the effluent is generally going to build up. So you need to be able to move that infrastructure around, and the council requirement is at least every 3 months. The other point that's important is that pigs are terribly destructive in terms of removing any ground cover that you have. And so you need to maintain a requirement of at least 50% ground cover. That's to minimise the loss of the surface ground and just make sure that you've got good coverage. And that there are requirements around how close pigs can be to other residential buildings and sensitive areas. So every other larger pig farm, there's a standard application process. So again, I'd refer you to that planning.vic.gov.au website, and I've also included the different zones where you can or can't keep pigs. And it's important that you set this up correctly before you get your pigs, because the last thing you want is fill your backyard up with pigs and have your neighbour complain. So there's some really good references that, and again, if you're going to get pigs, I'd strongly recommend that you just look up the Australian Pork Limited website, familiarise yourself with APL. They are the national body for the pig industry of Australia. They're based in Canberra, but they have some excellent publications that you can use, not only for planning where and how you're going to grow your pigs, but also there's a lot of information around training requirements and certainly more detailed information once you get your pigs, how to look after them. So, and you can also become a member of Australian Pork Limited. So it's worthwhile just having a look at what resources are available to you from them. Then if you're going to think about, well, what will I do in terms of rearing my pigs? I don't know who's on the other end of this computer, but I'm assuming that, given we're talking about small farms, that most people would have small numbers of pigs and will probably be growing them outdoors. But I think it's just important to highlight that the reason that a lot of people grow their pigs indoors is that feed is one of your major costs of production. So feed is generally around sort of 60 to 80% of your production costs. And certainly if you're growing your pigs indoors, because you have better control of their environment, it's going to be a lot easier for you to maintain those pigs in their comfortable zone of temperature, and that they therefore would have improved feed conversion efficiency. So, and feed conversion efficiency is basically defined as the kilograms of feed required to produce a kilogram of meat, and that can be expressed in various ways. But so if you're growing pigs outdoors, just be aware that you're going to require more feed than if you're going to be growing the pigs indoors. And just a little bit of a comparison, there's some data on how much feed is required in terms of tonnes for outdoor versus indoor farms. An average feed cost, and this feed cost is, I guess, kind of conservative at the moment, and you know, we're seeing that feed is probably currently the most expensive it's ever been. So you can certainly see that there is a difference in rearing your pigs indoors or versus outdoors in terms of the biggest cost, which will be your feed. I guess, why have the pigs outdoors? There's certainly some advantages in terms of setting up the costs or setting up your farm. So, I mean, there will still be significant costs, and we'll talk more about the requirements for housing pigs, but you will need to have good fences. Ideally, they'd be electrified. Ideally, you'd have reticulated water so that your pigs could or have water in all the paddocks that you house them in. But certainly there is an increasing awareness among the community on the welfare side of things, and there's an increase in market pressure to rear pigs, I guess, in a more natural environment, and the outdoor rearing system would be deemed as perhaps more natural to most consumers. So, so there certainly is an increasing demand for having pigs reared outdoors. So you may find more niche markets if you're going to rear pigs outdoors. I guess the other part of that is if you have other farming types, so if you have crops or if you have other animal species, pigs can be a fairly handy source of fertiliser for you. But, you know, again, I would certainly be referring to some of those resources like the APL environmental guidelines, or have a good agronomist to talk to. I mean, ideally you'd be doing things like measuring some of the key components like nitrogen and phosphorus within the soils before you even get your pigs, and just keep monitoring those elements every sort of 12 months or so to make sure that you're not over nutrifying your ground. I guess some of the other advantages of indoor housing is certainly your breeding efficiencies will be improved, and if you're aware, pigs are actually seasonal breeders, so they're not really designed to be getting pregnant around. The easy way to remember that is between Christmas and Easter, so the first 16 weeks or so of the year. So if you have pigs outdoors, they're less likely to be able to breed than if you have them indoors. A lot of that is driven by day length. So obviously if you've got pigs indoors, well then they will have less exposure, I guess, to the changes in day length. And as I alluded to before, if pigs are indoors, you'll have better control of their environment. Pigs are very susceptible to overheating, particularly adult pigs. You probably know that pigs have very poorly developed sweat glands, so they're unable to cool themselves down except by panting, or if you provide them with some sort of cooling, whether that be through surface water and evaporation from their skin. But you certainly need to ensure that if you have pigs outdoors that you have some way for them to cool themselves. So part of the piggery planning, you need to consider how much space you have, and again that, well, I guess the DSC equivalent. So like I said, one porker is 1 DSC, adult pigs are around 3 DSCs. And as I mentioned, you should rotate your pasture when you've got, you know, 50% ground cover still there. Think about the rainfall in your region. You can see from that paddock there that certainly there's really no ground cover left where the pigs have been housed, and it's basically a boggy mess. So, you know, ideally you would need to, from a welfare perspective, that's not a great thing. Pigs need to have enough clean, relatively clean, dry area for them all to camp, and certainly that sort of paddock in the furrow wouldn't be meeting that requirement. And the other thing, as I mentioned, pigs are very susceptible to heat stress. So if you are living in an area that has very extreme summer temperatures, I'd be really thinking twice about getting pigs and housing them outdoors. And you can see from that picture that's a little white pig that's been sunburnt. I mean, coloured pigs are still prone to getting sunburnt. It's just that they're less prone to getting sunburnt. So just because you've got Berkshire or large black pigs, just don't think that they're not going to get sunburnt. So, but yeah, certainly white pigs aren't as suited to being outdoors as the coloured pigs are. But they'll all get sunburnt if they don't have any shade. And also pigs do tend to be a bit silly sometimes, and even they will lie out in the sun when they shouldn't, and like little kids to get sunburnt. So some of the other nitty-gritty type things around legal obligations. So you need to make sure that you have a property identification code, a registered pig tattoo or ear tags, and you need to register with PigPass, know what swill feeding is, and make sure that you're competent to rear pigs. So I'll just go through all of those dot points one by one. So a property identification code really links the livestock on your property to you as the owner and to the address where the pigs are kept. And again, that varies a little bit with the state that you live in. I've just put up on the screen here a copy of the screen that you'll see if you register for property identification code in Victoria. It's no cost to do that. In Victoria, that is run through Digita. So it's a pretty easy thing to do, and anyone that owns a pig should have a property ID code. The other part of that is having some way to track the pigs that move from your farm or from your property. And again, the legislation is going to vary among the different states, but certainly you do need to identify your pigs when they leave your property. And that's really to so that the regulators are able to track pig movements in the case of an exotic animal disease or an emergency animal disease occurring in the country, or if there's a contamination issue and the product recall is required. So in Victoria, there's a requirement if your pigs are over 25 kilograms live weight that you have a body tattoo. So that tattoo will be assigned to you. So once you have a property ID code, you apply for a body tattoo, a tattoo number, again through Digita, and you'll have the tattoo made up for you by someone like Vaucluse or one of the other private tattoo manufacturers. But so in Victoria, it's the number 3 and then 3 letters after the number, and the body tattoos, it should be placed on the left shoulder. For little pigs under 25 kilos in Victoria, there is a requirement that all pigs have an ear tag, and that ear tag has the same number as the body tattoo has. So fairly simple. The other requirement is now that it's mandatory for anyone if you've got one pig, as is said on the screen, or if you have 20 pigs, you need to register with Australian Pork Limited for PigPass. So one of the things that you'll need to do before you go onto that PigPass site or you phone the PigPass help desk is make sure you do have a property ID code and you do have a tattoo, because they're 2 requirements you'll need to fill out for your PigPass form. The only time where you wouldn't need to complete PigPass form is if you are moving pigs, if you're not actually selling pigs, if they're moving within the properties that you own. So that's one thing to remember as well. And I mean, this is an old version of the pig pass form, but basically there are options, and you need to talk to the ATL staff about this, but there are electronic versions of the pig pass form that you can look at, or you can just purchase a pig pass book and just fill out those forms manually. So there's a section asking about your details, so certainly the number of pigs, the gender of the pigs, the description. There might be, you know, are they bacon pigs? Is it a cull sow? Special notes. You might have, say, animals that are a little bit compromised, or occasionally you might get a needle stuck in a pig. So you would need to list in there the identity of the pig that has that issue, and just note down what the concern is. And then there's certainly information about whether the pigs have been treated with anything, if they're still on a withholding period, so you're minimising the risk of any violative residues occurring in the pigs. This part C is very important, and it is similar to a stat dec, where you need to basically say that you understand the notes within the pig pass, and that you haven't fed swill to your pigs, and that they're fit to travel. So the swill component, and swill, I guess, is the common term that people think about, but I guess the new name for swill is prohibited pig feed. Within the last sort of 1 to 2 years, Australia developed a common definition for swill. Previously it varied among the different states. So it's important that you're aware of this definition. So basically pigs, anything that's of mammalian origin, or anything that's come in contact with mammalian origin material, should not be fed to pigs. So meat or meat products. So if you're talking about, the common thing is some people might feed their pigs bakery waste, but certainly if it's got, if it's a ham and cheese roll, you can't feed, or bacon roll, you can't feed that to your pigs. And certainly you are not allowed to let pigs graze on other dead livestock on your property, because that's considered as swill feeding as well. And finally, in terms of this section on responsibilities, the really important point is, are you competent to care for pigs? So when the Welfare Code was revised back in 2007, I think, one of the requirements was that anyone that owned a pig needed to be competent to care for them, or they needed to work under the supervision of someone who was. So, and there are specific requirements in terms of what competency is. So things like, are you able to identify whether pigs are sick or not sick? Are you able to treat pigs? Are you able to euthanize pigs if required? So it's important that you have a look at the Welfare Code, and that you're aware of whether, you know, what those requirements are for competency. So we're